All right, folks, this is Steve with Macro and Cheese. My guest today is a new guest. I have not had this guest on here, which is nice. It's nice to break new ground. My guest today is Steve Hall, who is a professor emeritus of criminology. He worked at the universities of Teesside, Northumbria, and Durham. He is a polymath, get that, a polymath who has published in the fields of criminology, sociology, anthropology, history, economic history, political theory, and philosophy. And for today's discussion, and this might be the most important part of it, class drives his understanding of the world. And for me, class is a part of the world that I'm trying desperately to incorporate as an American. Americans didn't get to experience a lot of the changes that Europe got to experience. They didn't really understand class in the way that Europeans understand class. However, as we go forward, there can be nothing more important at this moment than class because we have no democracy in the US. We've talked about this with our other guest, Aaron Good. We've talked about this with many of our guests. And as people become more open to recognizing the lack of democracy within the systems that we live in, we need to find common ground. And the common ground that we have is our class as workers, as the working class. And this has brought up a bunch of problems for me personally, because as a guy who started as a Republican, I was always a reductionist when it came to a lot of the oppressed people that I get to work hand in hand with these days as an activist. And witnessing the oppression and the ruthlessness of the ruling class on minorities within the United States and abroad, ranging from slavery on through to gay rights, and even, quite frankly, the drug war. I mean, this is class war. But recognizing that not everyone experienced that class war the same has been very challenging because the neoliberal era has weaponized identity politics. It has cheapened many of these real legitimate struggles. And as a result of the cheapening and the weaponization of those struggles and the outrageous, huge backlash from what we would call cancel culture, even if some disagree that it exists, many do not disagree that it exists. In fact, many live their lives to end cancel culture. And so, with these warring factions in play, how does one bring about unity in the working class to take on a capitalist class who has been ruthless and owns the levers of power in government and owns the powers of industry and literally fattens itself while the working class struggles? So I brought on my guest, Stephen Hall, today to discuss this because Stephen has some unique ideas that maybe aren't in line with what I would say. And I want to try to better understand them. And I want to find where we have common ground because ultimately, in order to bring unity to the working class, there's a lot of people that you probably don't agree with right now that are part of that working class. And you could see it in spades with what's going on with Trump's America and the bourgeois kind of elite that support Biden and ignore the struggle there as well. So you've got two sides of a capitalist class in the United States that rule over us, making us believe they care about us by plucking our heartstrings with identity politics. And the weaponization has really wrought havoc to the working class. So that is the subject of our discussion today. And with that, let me bring on my guest, Stephen Hall. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I mean, you heard my intro. What are your opening thoughts here? What do you think? Help set the stage, because obviously you're quite passionate about how identity politics has sidelined the left. I mean, you frequently point to The Death of the Left, the book that's been recently published. I'm curious as to your thoughts as it pertains to unifying the working class.
I think that class is a modern concept, isn't it? It's a fundamentally Marxist concept, which, by associating with Marxism means that most people in America will run a mile anyway. But it's an ancient concept at the same time. You have Geoffrey Distacquois' fantastic work about class struggle in ancient Greece. But the working class has always been regarded as the populace. And there's always been, from the economic elites and the political elites, an antipathy towards the populace as the mob. The working class, the great unwashed, as we call it in the UK, has always been an object of fear and an object of suspicion amongst middle class and upper classes in Europe. Huge number of works in the 20th century, for instance, Le Bon, people like Elias Canetti, talking about crowds and power, have been based on this terrible fear of the mob. And so working class in Europe has never really been allowed to approach the levers of power. We've had an independent Labour Party in 1905, which formed the Labour Party. It amalgamated all sorts of other fringe parties, which is what we're trying to do now. We're trying to talk about left unity amongst the fringe parties that are being successful in Britain at the moment. I suppose you heard of the Workers' Party, George Galloway's success, and is now an MP in Parliament from what was regarded as a fringe party by the British establishment. But the working class has never really been allowed anywhere near the levers of power. As soon as they've brought themselves together, coalesced into a political unity, a political force, an organisation, the middle class have moved in. And we saw this with the Fabianism in the early 20th century. Middle class intellectuals, H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw so I was trying to think of Sidney and Beatrice Webb were the main organisers of the Fabian group, to move in amongst the working class and educate them and cultivate them and move them in their direction, because the middle class left has always had this fear of the mob, that the working class is somehow dangerous. In your own country, you had William Jennings Bryan, I think, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
American Populist Party had a lot of very, very useful policies. But again, the establishment terrified. So they've always held the working class, the populace, as an object of fear, to be kept away from levers of power. But in Europe, I think we've had a little more success in creating working class organisations, the original Labour Party. And certainly after the war, 1945, when it had a huge Labour landslide victory, most of the members of Parliament were members of the actual blue collar, what you call in America, you like to call the blue collar working class. And we made huge changes after 1945, nationalisation of major industries, later steel and rail in the 50s and 60s. As soon as the working class get near the levers of power, things change. And the establishments, now this is not just the right-wing establishment, but the left-wing establishment have always tried to keep the working class at arm's length, away from the levers of power, because their expectations are much higher. They want things to change, and they want tangible change. They don't want high ideals and visions about a beautiful world of the future. They need things to change quickly. They need to pay their dental bills. They need to be able to pay their mortgages. They need jobs. They need tangible changes and little triumphs. And if the establishment can prevent these things happening, then, of course, people will eventually lose faith with the left and move back over towards whatever group is controlling the right wing of politics. At the moment, it's on the geopolitical front, it's neoconservatives, and on the economic front, it's neoliberals, isn't it?
Indeed.
And so they can disrupt the left, constantly disrupt it by becoming part of it and infiltrating it and turning it towards the centre, neutralising it, softening it, and making sure that it doesn't ask too much and doesn't have the ability to do too much.
Could you define the working class for me? Because I think that my understanding of it is if you work for a paycheck, you're working class.
Yeah. That's the economic concept, certainly. If you're wage dependent, you're working class. You have shared interests. Problem is that those shared interests are only shared to a certain extent in a very broad, abstract sense, because high-paid cybersecurity technicians, for instance, in this country on 120 grand a year are very, very different to baristas on 15 grand a year. So there are huge wage differentials in what the Bavarian sociologists call stratification across class lines. So those stratifications tend to be quite divisive. So we're wage dependent, but we don't all get we don't all get the same wages, so our interests diverge slightly. Culturally, the working class is very, very diverse. It's an amalgam of various cultures. In this country, we have regional cultures. We have Irish, Northern Irish, Southern Irish cultures, Scottish, Welsh. We have Northern Midland cultures. But it's odd because I think the differences are exaggerated. You know, stand in a pub in the centre of England. Birmingham is in the centre of England. I won't imitate a Birmingham accent because you won't understand the word I'm saying if I do. But Birmingham's in the centre of England. Stand in a pub and talk to people from various parts of the country. I worked in the steelworks in the 70s as an example, and because it was a fairly high wage occupation for working people, you got people from all over the country. It's surprising how well we got on. And these minor cultural differences aren't really too important. You know, there's a lot of rivalry and all, but it's quite friendly. We used to laugh and joke about it because we realized that our interests, our economic interests, were shared, keeping our wages high, making sure our jobs were secure, making sure our schools were educating our children, that we had a health service. Of course, we had a nationalised health service from 1945. We still have, but it's under great pressure from people who wanted to underfund it, run it down in order to privatise it. But our shared interests were fundamentally economic, but the cultural differences were exaggerated. So there's really still in this country, and you can tell me about America because I don't really know, but in this country, there's a potential dangerous unity amongst the working class. Still there. Still possible for those who are dependent on wages to recognize their shared interests and to vote accordingly for politicians who will organize the economy in their interests rather than the interests of global financial capitalists, investors, the global asset managers who are controlling the world's economy and decide which regions rise and fall. And the underinvestment in this country since 1960, when the growth curve flattened, because we had a huge growth curve from 1945 onwards, despite the austerity, despite everyone being fed up in the 1950s with austerity, we were actually growing very rapidly. Our industries were growing. Americans didn't like that, of course. Don't forget, Stephen, that the American right regard European countries as competitors, as dangerous competitors, and regard Europe as a dangerous competitor economically. They pretend to be friends, to have a special relationship, whereas really it's America's special and we have the relationship, as we all know. So our interests don't necessarily converge. But the growth curve flattened in 1960 and the private investors started to systematically underinvest in the UK. Tony Benn, the great British Labour politician, tried to put that right in the 70s with the National Economic Board in 1975 and the Labour Party manifesto in 1978, which promised to use North Sea oil revenue to refurbish and modernise British industry because they were fed up with the fact the Germans and French were moving ahead so quickly. Our plant was antiquated. I worked in steelworks in 1975. It was a diaphragm pump on the gas water recirculation plant, which had 1948 stamped on it. No investment in that steel since 1948.
Wow.
And we were underinvested. But we've always had that potential, the potential to recognize those interests and to vote for politicians who will refurbish our industries, who will create jobs and support our interests. And of course, the financiers are terrified of that because they want to be able to put their money where they want. Economies with low wages, low material costs, low taxes. And they don't really care about the Rust Belt in America, do they? They don't care about Flint, Michigan, and these places, these sort of derelict places that have been deindustrialized. When you see the pictures of the old Packard factory and the Champion spark plug factory, where they were once these hives of industry, whole communities, but they don't care about that. They want to put their money where they want. And they're terrified that the working class might vote in the sort of politicians who will bring back Keynesian capital controls, use the power of the state's currency to invest in the economy and start to become autonomous. They wanted to make sure that the working class don't vote for those sort of politicians.
It's funny when you reference the US, we have a very different history, obviously. You know, we're kind of a colonial power. We have always been empire of sorts. The foundation of the colonization of America is a story of a trail of tears.
Yeah, yeah,
It's literally a story of genocide as we experience this right now for the people of Gaza. The US as a Euro extension is really, quite frankly, a colonial outpost and now turned empire.
yeah,
And I think the challenge is different here because there's a lot of homogeneity in each of the countries of Europe. I mean, yes, there are immigrants. Yes, there are some differences,
yeah,
but the United States literally kidnapped blacks,
yeah,
Africans,
yeah,
and brought them here to build up the industry of this nation on the backs of slave labor.
yeah,
Then, after that ran its course, you had Reconstruction,
yes,
and Reconstruction period turned them into criminals now that they're no longer slaves, and so they had vagrancy laws and all these other laws that were spent to keep them in jail or to keep them working basically for pennies on the dollar. They never received anything. So this country that I live in is filled with stories like that, and people often say, "Oh, that was 100, 200 years ago." And saying, "No, you don't understand.
yes,
Jim Crow laws and all the other things kept going and going and going." So their struggle was far different than the average white factory plant worker's struggle as a class member of the working class. And so in this country, when we try and talk about uniting the working class, we don't have the shared struggle, the shared history, we have a divided history, a history of oppressors and rulers, and that has shifted significantly now. And the lack of acknowledgement of those grievances has created splinters all over the place. And I say splinters as if we were ever one piece of granite, but we are not. We never have been. I think you said it quite eloquently, actually, that the US is a melting pot that never melted. And here we are.
yes. I'm stealing that from Gore Vidal, and he said that in quite some time ago, and he was right, Stephen. You have a much tougher job over there. I don't envy the job because your divisions run so deep.
They do, and they're exaggerated daily.
Absolutely, and your culture is so ultra competitive because this works on the level of competitive individualism as well as competitive ethnic group. Because your hyper individualist culture is, and the world's never seen anything as individualistic as America.
It's awful.
Well, it gives you a lot of freedom. It gives you an awful lot of individual freedom. The American dream, of course,
A lot of one.
which is, a little bit of a fake. I don't know if we've got time, but if we've got time, you've heard the W.C. Fields story about the American dream, I suppose. Well, I'll tell you later if I have time. It's quite a funny story. That level of individualism has never been experienced in Europe. In fact, a lot of people fled Europe because of their religious differences. They were Protestants. Now, Protestants relocated God from the heavens, from an external power, into the conscience of each individual. So Christian Protestant individualism was the founding culture of the United States of America. And it is so hyper individualistic that really bringing anyone together in any way, shape, or form, the racial oppression and the racial hostility that still exists in the place is, I mean, you have such an incredibly difficult job. And also, don't forget that your nation is founded on a hatred of the state and taxation.
Which is crazy, right? Ultimately, the more that you think about what we're up against, because the US's number one export, aside from military weaponry, is neoliberalism. We outsource everything to the world, basically preaching that individualistic mindset that every problem you have is your own fault. Every success you've ever had is your own fault.
Yes.
If you win, it's all you. If you lose, it's all you. And shame on you. The Ayn Rand scourge is real. We
Yeah.
literally live in a libertarian hellscape.
This was all orchestrated, though, Stephen. This was all orchestrated. Don't give up on America. Don't forget that despite the huge racial differences, that the divisions between black and white workers after the Civil War were orchestrated. They were prevented from living in the same parts of the towns and the villages that were springing up as America industrialized. Deliberately segregated. And, after the First World War, right up until the New Deal, that separation continued and that hyper individualism continued. But during that very, very formative period of 1929 to 1933, the Americans just realized how bad neoclassical capitalism is. Didn't they? More than anyone else. We've all seen The Grapes of Wrath, the wonderful Steinbeck novel. We've all read about the Dust Bowl, the Great. The Americans learned a hard lesson there. And that was a fundamental watershed for change. In 1933, Roosevelt got in on a social democratic. I think we need to go further than social democracy because social democracy was too weak to prevent neoliberalism from usurping it. But it was the Americans who first voted in a social democrat, wasn't it? And in 1937, it's a little known fact. And I mean, I'm a sort of polymath, really, but I ended up working in the criminology department. That's an easy question to answer because a job came up and I took it. So I ended up working in the criminology department and I became a criminologist over the years. One of the things that I investigated were comparative homicide rates. The incredible thing between about mid 1935 and late 1937, which was Roosevelt's second term, wasn't it? And he really started to put his New Deal policies into practice in a big way. I mean, you even had state-funded theatre companies, didn't you? Giving us wonderful people like Orson Welles, John Cassavetes, people like that. We had the oh God, you remind me. What was the work program called? The work administration program. Oh bloody hell! Yeah, the W. What's it? I'm sorry, I'm getting old. My brain.
WPA.
WPA. Yeah, this was all organised and it worked very well, and it was getting America back to work. America in 1933, the homicide rate was about 11.5 per 100,000. That's very high. By the end of 1937, Roosevelt cut the American homicide rate in half.
Huh.
And that's very little known fact. And I wrote an article about that a while ago. Social democracy, it's not democratic socialism. It's not ideal. It's not perfect, but it had a massive impact. And it worried the American ruling class more than communism because they knew communism wouldn't work. Gosplan, for instance, the central command economy. I mean, how can you possibly find out and work out what everyone in little villages and towns across Russia want for their breakfast? It was a stupid idea. They have tales of people queuing outside of shops in Vladivostok, waiting for bacon and sausages, and a lorry load of mid-tan boot polish would turn up because a bureaucrat in the office in Moscow made a mistake. Now, if they'd stuck with the new economic policy of the market, who knows what would have happened to the Soviet Union? A controlled market might well have worked. But the social democratic policies were starting to work, and they were a road to my ideal is a democratic socialism. And I've always been a democratic socialist, a Benite in a sense. America adopted Keynesian demand management policies and capital controls before anyone in Europe did. So don't give up on America, Stephen. You were capable of doing it. In fact, you were the first to do it, and you had a huge success in the 1930s.
I think things have changed though in both
Yes.
technology, the surveillance state, the police state, the weapons of war, and the propaganda machine that manufactures consent
Yes.
has radically shifted. You used to have one newspaper that everyone read back in the day. You knew that there was a show at 5 p.m. that everybody sat in front of the radio or the television to listen to together. They heard the same things.
Sure.
Now we're overloaded with just data. It's not even information anymore. It's just data just thrown at us.
Yes, data overload. Yes, this is the Jean Baudrillard's notion of the obscene ecstasy of communication, he calls it. Go on.
We've checked out. We've given up. I mean, a lot of people are so overwhelmed that they're like little potato bugs.
Yeah.
And every bit of information that contradicts what they think just bounces right off their little shell. And the unfortunate part of that is, and I think this is an important thing that we need to discuss,
Yes.
is that we have no understanding of class in the US.
Uh,
We have no understanding of uniting beyond Democrat or Republican. We don't have that kind of history in this country, unfortunately,
Yeah.
to lean on. And even when you point to Keynes, Keynes did not see class the way that Marx saw class.
Oh, absolutely not.
And the unfortunate fact is that when you look at class in America, which is, I believe, the one way that we can fight back,
Yes.
most people, to your point earlier, would run for the hills. They'd be like, "Oh my God, class! Oh, they're talking about that Red Scare stuff," and then they break out all the CIA talking points about Stalin or whoever, and immediately their eyes glaze over and they become rabid.
Yes.
And with social media, which has been the way we communicate, so completely shut down with algorithms and shut down with little games that they play to keep us in our own little bubbles,
Yes.
we never build the kind of consensus that we could have built.
Yes.
I'm curious, your thoughts. You frequently point to that book, The Death of the Left.
Yes.
Help me understand. I don't see that path forward. I want to see that path forward. I see it has to be based on class because we would never have the numbers we would need to be able to make a dent. But help me understand.
Well, nobody in the 1920s, a European sociologist called Werner Sombart visited America and wrote that America is the last place in the world that you're going to have class consciousness or an organized class resistance. It is so atomized. It is so hyper competitive individualist that there's no chance of that happening. But after 1933, it did happen. So you can never write it off. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go through the misery of the 1929 to 1933 Dust Bowl again in order to wake yourselves up. That's not going to happen anyway, is it? With welfare and quantitative easing and all of these fiscal, well, they're just palliatives, aren't they? They're not really policies. They're just palliatives. They're ways of getting countries through very brutal market corrections, as the neoclassicals like to call it. So it may not happen to that extent, but there will be. Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, looks to what he calls the event, capital E. Now, the, the Wall Street crash and the Dust Bowl was an event, Stephen, capital E. But there are some other events. Gaza is an event. Let's not get into that huge controversy in this little discussion. But Gaza is an event. Events happen. Things happen that wake people up. And hopefully, should we hope for an event? Well, I don't know. Perhaps we should fear an event. Perhaps we should be rather circumspect about the possibility of an event because the event might be horrific. Or it might simply be a wake-up call. Was the great financial crash should have been an event. But as you said, this huge ideological machine, this sort of weird libertarian stroke neoliberal ideology machine that runs American culture went straight into action, telling people that austerity was necessary, that inflation is a big problem, that we can't spend any money, we can't create jobs and all the rest of it. So that ideology machine is still there, but the great financial crash was almost an event. It was almost an event. Are we due another one? Steve Keen, another heterodox economist who I have a lot of time for, outside of MMT. I'm not an MMTer as such. I have a lot of respect for MMT. I think it's the first port of call for anyone interested in heterodox economics because it's a pristine description of how the fiat money system, how the monetary plumbing works in the fiat money. It's great. It should be the first port of call. But there are other heterodox economists with good ideas. And there might be another financial crash. The whole thing could just come apart at any time because, of course, the way that liberal capitalism works is it's a credit system. And you have to lend money. And it's the old Marxist notion, as soon as money stops circulating, it's dead, isn't it? They must invest. They must constantly invest. And if they can't invest, the whole thing crashes. They inflate assets like they did with housing throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, inflating their assets to try and create a market, a durable market. But it didn't work. Then they set up the derivatives market with collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps, basically selling each other debt and insurance policies on top of the debt in order to keep on They've got to keep on lending money and receiving compound interest because that's how the system works. And if they hit a block in that system, then an event occurs. I think let's call the GFC in 2008 a Neely event.
Okay.
And there may be an event, but they managed to QE, helicoptered in a load of money. QE is non-inflationary, of course, because it disappears into the bank's reserve accounts at the central bank. It's just basically to obviate a liquidity crisis. But what we're looking at is a possible event. We don't know what's going to happen because this system of lending out money, I don't know if you've read Michael Hudson, another heterodox economist.
Oh, I've had him on here quite a few times. Yes, sir.
Yeah, he's a great economist and he really knows his stuff. And he knows that really that the problem is that the debt crises, the old world, he's written a lot about the Jubilees and the Deror, of course, the way that debts were cancelled, property was turned in order to try to get out of social hostilities and reboot economies. The Greeks and the Romans were the first to cancel the debt jubilees. But can we keep on creating what Steve Keen calls debt zombies? And if they're compound, they've explored everywhere now, haven't they, Stephen? I mean, they've done China, they've done Indonesia, Mexico. They've lent their money out to low-wage economies, and now these economies are developing. They've created their own organization, the BRICS. They're starting to talk about their own possible reserve currency in the future. They're starting to trade in their own currencies. They're challenging American dollar hegemony. And they're starting to fight back. So will the BRICS cause an event? Will there be an event? We don't know. So don't give up. Things will change. And we have to have policies ready for the event. If something does happen, we have to say, look, this is the second financial crisis. We're not going to get out of this. We can't helicopter money our way out of this. We're going to have to change the nature of our economy. We're going to have to change the way our economy operates, and then we can start looking towards the heterodox economists who receive such a trashing, don't they, on social media by the libertarians and neoliberals.
Oh, yes.
You can tell how worried they are by the amount of invective and ad hominem they throw at heterodox economists. But that's a sign of fear.
Yeah, you look at the documentary Finding the Money, and I don't know if you've had an opportunity to see it yet.
Not yet, no.
My chief complaint of the movie is that it doesn't have Bill Mitchell in it. That's my chief complaint, okay?
Yes.
But beyond that, though, the thing that I find fascinating is that we're exposing just how little the establishment economists, these neoclassical slash new Keynesian type economists, know about any of this stuff. They have no concept of money creation.
Yeah,
They have no concept of how banks actually function.
absolutely.
It's kind of like placing the emphasis of a pronunciation of a word on the wrong syllable, on the wrong consonant, on the wrong vowel. And they don't get it. And it's funny, ha ha ha. But the problem here is this: what I see in that documentary and what you said in particular about these events and having policies ready.
Yeah,
We've got policies all over the place. I mean, I know I come from the MMT world as an activist. I want to be clear there. I don't want anybody to confuse anything I say as if I'm saying I'm more than an activist, right? I am an
sure.
activist. But that said, when I see this stuff, it requires agency. Okay. Now, you have a
Yes.
couple choices. If you can vote for people that are like yourself with the same class interests, and they have a real legitimate opportunity to
Yes.
run for office and have a real opportunity to make a difference, that's a democracy and that's something that can happen.
Yeah.
But we do not have that in the United States. We have corporate law, corporate control, and we have cash as speech. And corporations use that to great effect. Lobbying is legalized bribery. And we have no means as a working class to fight back through the channels that the ruling class has given us to operate within. So that means we have to operate either A,
Yep.
as fake placebo beings within this system that we have no agency in, or B, operate outside of that system to create the kind of dual power counter revolutionary force, if you will, or revolutionary force. Let's call it what it is. We are screwed if we don't do that. I mean, and so
It's Dostoevsky. We're notes from the underground. We're notes from the underground, but we have to keep our notebooks going. And we have to keep on thinking, and we have to keep on thinking about communicating. If there's one criticism I could throw at the heterodox economists, but the criticism being thrown at all economics and economists, because economics economics is difficult. It requires technical knowledge. It's like engineering. You need to know how things work. And it's not easy to get across to people. When I start sometimes talk about, MMT or post-Keynesianism, we still have pubs over here in England, you'd be glad to know. When I talk about them, their eyes start glazing over, Steve, and they think, oh no, he's going to start talking about the currency issue and inflation
nice.
and things again, and they'll, and I can tell that, they don't really want to talk about it. So I start talking about the football, which is not called soccer, by the way. It's the football over here. Football. Yeah, so, yeah.
Well, I want to say something else too that I think that is very, very important. I was on a radio program, Sputnik Radio, interestingly enough,
Oh yeah, I know it. Yeah,
and I was talking to them, and I mentioned, that one of the other things is whenever we read the news as if they're talking to us,
yeah,
that they're speaking to us as individuals.
yes,
But when you read deeper and you dig deeper, you realize that they're talking to their class interests. They're not talking to the working class.
yes,
When they say it's a great think about this. The newspaper said it's a great economy. And so in order to maintain this great economy, we've got to suppress wages because
yeah.
upward rise of wages is causing blah, blah, blah.
Inflation.
Well, who are you talking to?
Yes.
Who are you talking
Yes.
to? Is that to a worker? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Because if a worker heard that, they'd be like, well, you're goddamn right. I want my wages to go up, right?
Well, exactly. And capitalists like Henry Ford would have agreed with them, didn't he? When he said famously, "There's no point in paying his workers' wages are too low to buy the cars they make."
Yes.
And this was at the heart of Keynesian effective demand. Look, we know that rising wages and what they call disparagingly money printing, which is actually accountants, but it's just simply crediting accounts on the positive side. There's nothing to do with printing anymore. Well, they do print a little bit, but so we know that price rises cause inflation. We know that, but of course they will deny that to the death because they reckon that if you have price controls, you lower price, that will create shortages. It probably won't. And what they do is that they present economic models that have human decisions completely extracted from them.
Yep.
They talk about natural laws. Now, any good economist, I mean, someone like, he's not particularly heterodox, but Ha-Joon Chang, the Korean guy working in Cambridge at the moment, is a fantastic economist, knows how the systems work. He will say that, look, you've got in every natural law proposed by an economic model, you've got to insert a human decision. And by constructing these economic models with these ludicrously complex equations, most of which are complete nonsense, by the way.
Yes.
It's just utter rubbish. It's like doctors calling everything by Latin names so that you won't, multiple sclerosis, the disease that affects many muscles. I mean, you know what I mean? Botanists do the same, don't they? Calling plants complicated names in order to deter people, to make it an exclusive profession. And they extract even the basic laws of supply and demand have human decisions at them. They don't have to rise. If you have a field full of 10 goats, I'm going to simplify things. Economists will roll their eyes right now and they go, oh, God, listen to him. No. But I'm going to oversimplify something ridiculous. You have a field, if you have tiny land economy with a field of 10 goats in it, and the little tiny land government issues 10 groats, then one groat equals one goat. Now, what the neoliberals and the neoclassics say is that if the tiny land government issues 20 groats, then you need 2 groats to buy a goat, therefore you've halved the value of your currency. But the decision is that the goat herd doesn't have to charge 2 groats for the goat. He can leave them and they put the rest of their savings, or they build a school and hospital or go on holiday with it. Even the basic law of supply and demand is not natural. These models simply give people guides to the action that everyone is expected to do. They expect everyone to behave in the way that the model has allegedly analyzed. In fact, it's an instruction. It's an instruction to decision makers.
Uh-huh.
This is what you've got to do. If there's more money about, you've got to charge more.
That is so brilliant. What you just said, exactly right. I tell people these are signals, market signals.
Of course.
Hey, we're spending money, we're printing money.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, that's the signal. Let's raise prices. Okay.
Yeah.
Now we're going to go ahead and raise interest rates because guess who wins? The rich.
Exactly.
Guess who loses? The poor.
Yes.
Once again, we've got the interest income channel flaming hot. People with money making money hand over fist.
Absolutely.
The working class getting screwed more and more and more.
Absolutely. And let's follow that. You're absolutely right. We end up being screwed. We end up with higher mortgages because of interest rates. They won't raise taxes because we're a culture based on the hatred of taxes. We think tax is theft of our rewards. They're stealing our rewards. They're stealing our enjoyment. So there's this constant moralless tale. But let's follow that. Let's look at the goat herd again. So the goat herd wants to raise prices. It's not a natural law of supply and demand. It's just a decision. No, but who's behind the goat herd? Where did he get the money for the goats? He got the money from the goats from the Bank of Tinyland. And the Bank of Tinyland has investments, savings, institutional funds from other lands in the same part of the world. They're clamoring for returns. So the goat herd makes that decision thinking that the shareholders and the asset managers, Larry Fink and all of his pals, want more returns. So I've got to charge more. And he will think that the goat feed guy in the field who sells him the goat feed, he's going to charge more as well. So everyone assumes that they're going to act as the model allegedly analyzes, but is actually dictating. It's telling them how they should act. It's almost like a set of commandments for action, that determine action and give that action a moral jacket. And this is a good thing to do. You're being a good person and you're doing exactly what's expected. And then they put a load of stupid equations and all the rest of it, as if they're all Einstein equals MC squared. It's all nonsense. And they tell you these equations will determine your action. In fact, the action they've taught people to do is what's determining the equations.
This reminds me, I'm sure you've seen the movie Star Wars. In the very first one, they're pulling up, I can't remember, is it on Tatooine? They're pulling up to the bar and the Empire is standing there and Ben Kenobi's in the land speeder with Luke and he's like, these are not the droids you're looking for. These are not the droids we're looking for. And it's like, this is exactly what's happening. I feel like the puppeteer.
Yes.
But think about what you just said and what we're talking about. There are so many things that have been programmed into our psyche.
Yes.
That are at a deep level, a level so deep that I can sit there and tell you something, I can show you something, but until you have a change of heart, until you've had an event of your own, a personal event, have you received the Lord and Savior, as blah, 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 until you've had your come to Jesus moment where you agree to change or you agree to see things differently or whatever it is that snaps you out of the trance,
yes,
you are going to continue to follow the playbook because that's what you know.
Yes.
And it's so deeply ingrained that to do anything other than that seems ludicrous.
Well, that's true. We're basically describing a large-scale religious cult. And that's what it is. There's no doubt about it. It's a belief system. And the belief system is very, very powerful. And it's scientized. It's given a load of equations to prove that this is the God's natural order in the world. And it's also, you're right, modern psychologists like Tony Damasio who talk about the way the psyche and the body's neurology is structured and molecular constitution is structured, means that these beliefs really penetrate right down. They penetrate down to our nervous system, and they penetrate right down to give messages to the molecular basis of our bodies. If you look at a very simple creature, it only has really two or three commands. It's either to stay where it is or move to somewhere where it can survive. or to stay where it is and improve that environment. Now, only the primates can improve their environment. So the only primates have the 3 molecular commands. The other organisms have 2 molecular commands to move or to stay. And the neurological level sends messages to the molecules. We stay or we move. So basically what neoliberalism is telling the body at the molecular level is we stick with this, we stay with this. This is the environment. This is how deep it has penetrated, not just to our feelings and emotions and neurology, to the body's molecular level it has penetrated. We must stay with this. This is Adam Smith. This is the creation of wealth. This will make us wealthy. It will make us free. It will be a judicious combination of freedom and prosperity. Will not get any better than this. It was Francis Fukuyama, one of your guys again, Stephen. I have to remind you, Francis Fukuyama. Yes, you're trouble, you people. I'm telling you. Yes, Francis Fukuyama, who declared the end of history. As European philosophers have declared since then, we don't really believe it's the end of history, but we are forced to act as if we do. You don't have to believe this, but you have to act as if you do believe it.
Double plus good.
Exactly. It's as good as it gets. That was a movie as well, wasn't it? It's as good as it gets. And we believe that communism was a disaster. The Soviet Union was a disaster because Gosplan was a disaster. They made huge strides. They were great at making big stuff like bombs and space rockets and things like that, but they were terrible at getting boot polish and sausages to the right people at the right time. You heard of Richard Nixon's kitchen campaign, didn't you?
Yeah. Go ahead, tell the fans.
59. Well, Khrushchev, I mean, anyone who's been through Stalingrad deserves a bit of respect. Nikita Khrushchev was a Russian. I think, I might be wrong, don't quote me on this, but I think he was amongst one of the first groups to arrive and putting the flag on the Reichstag. Remember that famous photo, at the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. But he certainly in the Battle of Stalingrad, and he was sitting there and he invited over the American ambassador, who was at the time, I think it was the late 50s, was a certain person called Richard Nixon. and so Richard decided to take over his secret weapon. And Khrushchev heard about this. He said, what is a secret weapon? What's this secret weapon? What's he bringing over? I hope it's nothing dangerous. He said, no. I'm just going to bring some consumer items. So he came over with the latest American kitchen units and all invited the Russian housewives. I'm sorry to be sexist, but that's what they were in those days. Housewives, they had a strict gender division of labor, and women were concerned with domestic labor. That's changed. Good thing. And they were all coming. Oh, look what I could do. This is fantastic. You've got a quadruple hob burner. You've got a timer on your oven. Oh, God, timer on. I don't have to stand there with my watch that doesn't work, trying to work out the time for my stroganoff. You know what I mean? And they were cooing over these wonderful consumer items. And Khrushchev was just really... Am I allowed to say pissed off?
Sure.
Yeah, he was, I know, I think you might say pissed. We say pissed off over here. He was really, and he would said famously, we will bury you. Nixon, of course, reported back and he said, this is a Cold War. These are going to send nukes. But what he meant was, we'll outproduce you.
Indeed.
We will make better kitchen units. We will put timers on our ovens and we will do all this and we will do it better. Unfortunately, Stephen, they didn't. They couldn't because they didn't have market signals to work off. They had abandoned the new economic policy, which Lenin was keen to go, but of course Stalin wanted to centralize everything, have total control of everything. So they didn't have the ability to do that. And consumer dissatisfaction more than anything else. I mean, they had exploding TV sets. Well, when they suddenly found out that people wanted stuff, they hastily set up a bureau. We'll have the bureau and we'll set up a design bureau and a production bureau. And so they started making, when TVs became popular in the 50s. Yeah, remember they all started coming out in the 90s. Well, no, sorry. I'm assuming you're an old geezer like me.
Oh, I'm old, but I'm not quite that old.
Yeah. No. You're still a handsome young man, but I'm a grizzled old geezer. And I remember my mother talking about when, televisions, I think the first televisions came out the year I was born, 1955. And Russians heard about this and they hastily made these television sets, which were totally crap. And they started exploding in the room, and the tubes were exploding because they hadn't been made properly. Consumer dissatisfaction brought down the Soviet Union more than anything else. But the Americans are consumer fixated. I mean, they'll queue around the block for the latest iPhone. Have you seen them? You know, this sort of stuff. They created the consumer subject. Thomas Frank's wonderful book on the conquest of cool in 1960, where they changed the whole advertising scenario. All the advertising messages were changed from family man to rugged Marlboro man, producing stuff for these sort of individuals, these cool individuals who were striding out in the sort of Ayn Rand fashion, like John Galt, and making themselves and the country wealthy. So consumerism took off in America, and consumerism is a drug, you know, it's almost a religion.
It
People,
is.
it is. And this country, consumerism had a tougher time. We tended to love you because you'd helped us. Well, you were late, of course, but yeah, you got there eventually. You helped us during the war against the Nazis and against the Axis powers. And after that, we sort of fell in love with you. Started importing all your music and all your Levi jeans and all the rest of it. We became highly American influenced, especially during the counterculture, which looked sexy and edgy and all the rest. It wasn't, of course. It was a substitute for politics. And we imported all this stuff. But we had, as you were saying at the beginning, we had firmer identities. We had much stronger traditional identities in work, in religion, in region, and in locale and community. You know, I would describe myself as a steel worker from concert and a socialist. That was my identity. Yeah.
Right.
I didn't need a load of consumer trappings to construct my identity. But those identities were missing in America. People didn't really relate too strongly. They related more to their ethnic groups, Italian American and Irish American, Jewish American, etc. And consumerism didn't really have too much to get rid of in order to start. So it's easier to sell consumer symbolism to Americans as symbols of their identity.
Let me take us into this last thing here because we've talked a lot about some good history and all, but what really brings me to today is that I look and I see heterodox economists whom I happen to have championed for 15 years,
Yeah.
and a lot of
Yes.
what comes out sounds a little bourgeoisie, kind of highbrow, polite society kind of things. And I'm just very anecdotally, I am sitting here with 5 teeth that desperately need a root canal right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have any dental care, and in fact, as I told you before we started this, I didn't sleep last night because of my teeth hurting so badly. So when I hear them talking about what a great economy it is and Biden sticking the landing and other things that I feel are quite offensive,
Yeah.
it doesn't measure up. It's kind of like said, reading the paper, and you see that they're clearly not talking to me, the quote unquote voter, if you actually believe we're voting, which we aren't.
No.
But if you believe that we are, they're not talking to regular people. They're talking to invest classes. They're talking to ownership classes. And if you look at regular Jane and Joe six-pack, we're told to lump it, basically. We're told, hey, Biden's doing great. Don't forget Trump. He's so horrible. And I'm not voting for Trump, but I'm not voting for either of them.
No.
I don't see my class interests being represented by either person. And I don't see the economist even talking about things from a working class perspective either. I see them talking about it from a capitalist class kind of environment. What are your thoughts on the messaging? Because when I bring this stuff up, socialists don't want to hear anything about MMT. They don't want to hear this heterodox stuff. They're like, that is just more capitalism. That's more nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah.
It falls on deaf ears. What your thoughts?
And this is how they got us into consumerism. We became what we bought and what we displayed and what we wore and what sort of car we drove, what we drove in. And this is why America became so consumer fixated, because there wasn't that much to get rid of, really. We had much stronger identities over here. But eventually consumerism triumphed. Our regional identities are now much weaker than they once were, which is, I think, is tragedy, because we had such incredibly rich cultures. I come from a place called Newcastle upon Tyneside, yeah? the home of Hank Marvin and Mark Knopfler and Sting and people like that. We had a tremendous musical heritage back in our folk tradition. We've written some of those beautiful folk songs you've ever heard, but we started to lose that. We started to lose that tradition because we were being Atlanticized. American culture was taking over. You were much sexier. You know what I used to say in the 50s, the problem with Americans is they're overpaid, they're oversexed, not over here. That was what their sort of jokey sort of way of putting it. You must understand how powerful your culture was, how attractive and sexy it was. Of course, West Germany, apart from the fact that you used West Germany as an investment shock absorber, if your investments weren't producing the returns anywhere else, they would certainly produce it in Germany and Japan because you almost had to reconstruct them from the ground up. And you started pumping money through the Marshall Aid Plan into West Germany. And you created a very sexy place in West Germany. And the East Germans would be sort of peering over the Berlin Wall thinking, oh, I wish our life was as sexy and wealthy and interesting. I wish we had all those consumer goods and Mercedes-Benz and BMWs and all the rest of it. American consumerism is immensely powerful, both in America and outside.
How do you see consumerism impacting the working classes? Is that the identity based on what I can afford? I can afford to buy this nice new car. You can't, so I'm better than you.
Sure.
This individual, I'm the winner, you're the loser, the zero sum thinking.
Absolutely. It creates competitive hierarchies within the working class culture.
And that is a divisive thing, obviously.
Of course. Well, socialism and communism in a much firmer way. And socialism is about worker control of the means of production. It's as simple as that. And if workers have control of the means of production, they can make sure the right stuff's produced and that it's shared around equally and people have a chance to participate and work in it. And if there's an overproduction of labour, that means you have a shorter working week. One of our great old union leaders, Arthur Scargill, I suppose you've heard of the miners' strikes in 84, 85. He suggested that we go down to a 4-day and then a 3-day working week because of machines are making our cars now. And we were promised a life of luxury, weren't we? In leisure in the 19th century, when we the technology, it's basically made everyone's life more stressful. The opposite. More people have, can do more work. Each individual can do more work with a machine. So the means of production, it doesn't see MMT, heterodox, post-Keynesianism really having, because it's all demand-driven. Keynesianism was demand-driven. Keynes didn't really care who was producing anything. Whether it was the British government taking over steel and coal and energy and rail, or whether it was private, it was a demand-driven. And most heterodox economists are also driven by aggregate demand, notional demand, and effective demand. And effective demand being the most important. That people have money in their pockets and they can afford to buy stuff. But who's producing that stuff and who's making the profits from it? Who's controlling production? Who's controlling the direction of the economy? Seems to be a little bit on the periphery but I think there are exceptions, such as Bill Mitchell, for instance, the MMT, who I think is more socialist inclined. I hope if he's listening, he doesn't mind me.
No, he said it in my most recent podcast.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know, Bill. I mean, I did a little mini tour with them in England a few years ago, where I was talking about their rather. Oh, how can I put it? How their methods of communication could be slightly improved to somewhat. He would say that what's most important is that we take over the means of the production of money. And if we have the means of production of money, we can decide where investment goes. Those will respond straight away. If you do that, you need capital controls and capital exchange controls. In other words, you can't let capital out of your country all the time if you want to invest it in your industry. And if you want to fend off the bond vigilantes and the forex vigilantes who will try and devalue a currency and bid up your interest rates, you need some way of defending yourself against them. And that means capital controls, central banks buying up bonds and buying long instead of selling short and all the rest of it. We know all of this. I'll go and go through the boring technical details because they bore me as well as everyone else, to be honest with you. But if we have control of the production of money and we have the control of investment, some MMT and heterodox don't like to make the distinction between spending and investment. And they're right, because it's all spending, isn't it, really?
Yep.
But there's a tradition of distinguishing between spending and investment. Spending seems to be profligate. It's a loss, whereas investment is a gain. for the future. Investment is you're creating something that will be useful in the future. So there's a very, very important ontological and ethical distinction between the two that the economists, because they're not very good at philosophy and all the rest, they tend to miss all that. It's important to make that distinction. If we are controlling investment, we control money, control investment democratically through representative democracies, then we can start to rebuild economies in a fair way, in a way that creates jobs, in a way that has union representation on jobs. And we in this country, believe it or not, are still talking about renationalising the railways. The Labour Party has given in because the fringe parties like the Workers' Party, which I'm in, by the way, I'm a member of the British Workers' Party, that we have got a couple of candidates. We got George Galloway into Parliament. And they're worried that the fringe parties are getting more votes. The independent councillors are up. The Labour Party and Conservatives are toast. Let's just have let's rub our hands and enjoy that moment. The Conservatives are toast. The Labour Party's doing okay, not as well as they thought. They'll probably get into power. But we have a chance of power broking, getting in a few members of the Parliament and having some say in the close decisions. So they're worried about that. And there are some positive things happening, Stephen, and we can keep on pushing. I don't think simply educating people in economics on Twitter is necessarily the way to do it.
Yeah.
I don't think we should stop doing that. I don't think we should stop doing it. I think we should keep on doing it because some people are interested and it sparks an interest to go off. They read Randy Ray's books or Stephanie's books or whoever, and they do learn. But I mean, the majority, they're too busy. It's all a bit too difficult. Some of them failed their maths at school, and it's all a bit too tricky. It's like trying to teach people what would be the equivalent. It's not as complex as astrophysics or quantum mechanics. Let's not elevate it to that level, but it's at least as complex as engineering, motor engineering. So it's fairly complicated. It's not something that's an easy sell. And I'll say something quite controversial here. I don't think the job guarantee is an easy sell. I agree that Cheneva, wrote a very good book about it. It does all what it says on the tin. It'll automatically stabilize wages, stabilize prices, effective demand, and all the rest of it. Give people a job. It will be sort of spatial Keynesianism in the sense that it can help to regenerate some of the areas made derelict by deindustrialization. Deindustrialization was the crime of the 20th century, the real crime of the late 20th century. It can do all that, but it's a very hard sell, especially in this country, because it seems like it's calling people rejects who are being put on a government program who can't get a proper job. The English workers are very proud people. Very, very proud. We had huge pride. We made the world's greatest ships with our inventions. We invented the steam engine, for God's sake, We have huge pride in our engineering tradition, in our work, and we don't want to be seen as sort of government workers in yellow jackets with JG stamped on the back, go around singing songs in old folks' homes and soupy hooting in the streets, we want people. They want a proper job. So my advice to MOT people is that that's a good idea, but it's not a great sell. It's not going to attract people in. Promising proper jobs, industry jobs, public services, direct labour forces, to doing that sort of thing, where people can give proper jobs, proper wages, job security. That's the way forward. So our identities as workers are still there. We don't stand outside shipyards' gates in crowds of 2,000 anymore. You can find the working class in cafes and restaurants and all sorts of little places. It's all atomized. Britain is a service economy, and America's quite happy to keep Britain as a service economy because that's one competitor out of the way.
Indeed. I want to break in on that momentarily before we close out. I just want to say this. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that not just activists make, but people that are just kind of stumbling onto the job guarantee is they try and make it more than it is. Okay. And, I hear some trying to sell it as a green jobs program, and you can have a green jobs program at more than a living wage, at a professional wage, at a gilded wage, whatever. But the problem is they try to take what is considered to be the base, which is the job guarantee, which is the employer of last resort. We're talking about providing work as opposed it like, for example, in the US, if you're released from prison,
Yeah,
you're not going to find a job, but yeah, a condition of your release is to have a job.
yeah,
So we have recidivism where people end up back in jail
of course.
because of this. So in America, in the US, I should say, we need something like this to prevent this nonstop revolving door in and out of the prison system based on really, really pathetic ideas. But the reason why it's there the way it is because people are trying to sell it as career work.
Yeah.
And, Warren Mosler, I don't agree with his political angles on some things, but from a perspective of economics, he's talking about the job guarantee as the transition job going from here to there.
Sure, sure. But if it's a transition, why sell it? Why put it at the foreground? Let's just keep it in the background. What we should be doing is trying to sell the ideas that if we, as Bill Mitchell argues, if we take over the means of production of money and we can invest, we can create proper jobs before we need a job guarantee.
Heck yes. Agreed.
And that's what we should be leading with. I mean, we shouldn't be ditching the job guarantee, but to lead with it, that is your jab in the ring. It's not a very good jab. It's not Larry Holmes' jab, that one. I agree with you. We need to take the job guarantee down a peg or two and be a little bit quieter about it and talk about investment, talk about real jobs, talk about control, talk about onshoring of industry. Don't want to do that too much, upset China, of course, but we need progressive, high productivity. We need to move into the fourth industrial revolution, the green transition. We know it's going to happen. We know there are massive problems with lithium mining and the conditions of the. We know that, but that's the same for everything. Same, copper's the same. So we know we're moving. We're moving ahead. We need to move America and Britain and Europe ahead. We need to help the developing world. We need good relationships with the BRICS economies because the BRICS economies are going to become powerful whether we like it or not.
I am about cooperation, but I will just say from my vantage point, and this is kind of my final word before I ask you for your final word. You know, a lot of the policy space, it doesn't take into consideration that I can't just go to the voting booth and vote my way to what I want.
Yeah.
And this is, I think it abrogates a lot of the responsibility of us to participate in rising up and saying, I won't take this anymore. And we become complacent. And when we don't get our way with that little sticker we put on our forehead that said I voted, we just go, oh well. And quite frankly, we have stopped doing the things like we've stopped really organizing. We've stopped coming together as a people and saying what we want, what we demand, and making it so. And
Yes.
because of that lack of imagination and that lack of fortitude, all that stuff you had said about we need these things, well, we may need them, but we're at the mercy of the capitalist class based on the way the system works to agree with us. They've got to do it or it doesn't happen because we don't have that. And we have to accept that in this class war, we have to actually be prepared to fight.
Yeah.
And I don't see that fighting spirit. I see a weeping, a knee bend to fake electoralism and basically just going along to get along, kind of like 1984, where it's just like, oh, well, I don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to keep my head on and not commit a thought crime. I'm just going to keep walking forward. And I think we need to begin to think about maybe having some thought crime, maybe think about breaking the mold, maybe doing something other than just going to the ballot box and thinking, I'm going to change society by hitting this button.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree with you. The opposite of that, of course, is to grow from the grassroots. I have no faith in that either. I don't think there are any grassroots. I think we're living on scorched earth in terms of politics.
Amen.
So let's forget all about that. What we do have are some very pissed off people. In Europe, don't forget they can be persuaded to go to the far right as well. The Gilets jaunes, the Canadian truckers, are this sort of demonized as examples of populist uprisings. Let's stop demonizing people and calling them populists. It's a pejorative, that term. And let's just think of them as working people. There are fringe parties We need unification of fringe parties. We need to be talking economics to the fringe parties, just persuading them that there are ways in which we can reboot our economies. We need to be educating the fringe politicians. Because a lot of politicians don't really have time to become economically literate. We need to be we need to be preparing policies. We need to be accumulating knowledge, collating it, and putting it into. And let me say this, into comprehensible books and pamphlets so that people can understand it. That's the main thing. It just goes too highfalutin, and there's too much preachiness and lecturing going on about, in the heterodoxy economics. We need to talk to people simply and so that they understand what's happening and be prepared for an event. Nobody can predict history. I think there are about a dozen economists who predicted the great financial crisis. Nobody knows when the next one's going to come. Nobody predicted Putin's invasion. We can't predict history. Events will happen. Things will happen. We don't know what, but we have to be prepared with the right policies, with the right organized political parties. This means as much unification as we can, amongst the left. The old joke, you don't know it's a leftist party until it's had its first split. We need to stop. We need to stop bickering about cultural issues, and we need to try to get black people, Asian people, white people together to recognize their shared interests in the economy. And can we combat competitive individualism right now? Can we persuade people to be socialists? Of course we can't. But an event will happen, or a series of events will happen, where people will say to themselves, "This is dead. This has now died. This collapsed." And we must. This has happened in history. Look at the collapse of the Bronze Age, 1100 BC. Don't get me talking about that because I'm writing a book about that at the moment. Don't get me having at least another 2 programs worth out of me. And if you think economics is incomprehensible, wait, all this stuff. But it has happened periodically in history. History changes. Things just collapse. I mean, Michael Hudson's work on the collapse of that. I don't know if you've had him on talking about that, but it'd be great to get him in to talk about the collapse of the ancient world into debt crisis and all the rest of it. He's written a book called The Collapse of Antiquity, which I've got a lot of time for. So things will happen, Stephen, and we have to be prepared. And we have to have as many people as we can prepared. We have to get them on side. I'm not sure talking about economic models and job counties is the way to do that. We have to get them on side. We have to try and to promote as much understanding as we possibly can and get through the fringe politicians. Some fringe parties are starting to win elections in this country. So people are realizing that the uniparty, as we call it over here, you call the Dems and 2 cheeks of the same backside, as George Galloway calls it. That the uniparty is people are losing faith in it. The voting in the council elections over here was about 29%. People are fed up with it, and they're getting fed up with the austerity, the pressure, the traffic jams, everything. They're just getting generally more and more pissed off. And then an event comes, forces austerity on them. And, then at that point, we have to be ready to get out on the streets and start persuading people that there's another way.
Amen. All right. Folks, my name's Steve Grumbine. I am the host of Macro and Cheese with my guest, Steve Hall. We are out of here.